So you can think of a class basically as a template that we're going to use to create objects at runtime. There's an important distinction between the concept of a class and an object. The class, that's basically the template or the cookie cutter that you use to generate objects. The objects, when your application is physically running, represent the implementations or instantiations of those classes. So your responsibility is to create a class, and at this design time, when you write your class, you decide what types of methods and fields and other members that the class will contain. Now, controlling the behaviors of these objects at runtime is basically what makes your application work, and that's what object-oriented programming is all about. You create classes that represent the basic elements of your application or of your work environment, and then by manipulating these objects through their members, that's what makes the application work. Now, when you create class definitions, the members that those classes can contain basically fall into a couple of general categories. We have properties, which are attributes, fields, also known as data members, methods, which are the physical actions that the class can execute, and events. Those are notifications or things that the class can actually do. Now, when you create a class, one of the things we're going to have to worry about is accessibility. Accessibility is basically the visibility of the class. Where can we see this class? From where can we actually manipulate it? Since an application in C# is actually a collection of multiple classes, it's important to understand how those class elements and the members of the classes themselves can actually be manipulated. There are really two different levels of accessibility for classes. Classes can either be public or they can be internal. If you mark a class as public, that means that that class is basically accessible to other classes without restriction at all. As long as the classes have access to your class, your public class, then the class can be instantiated and implemented. An internal class, on the other hand, is only available to other classes that are in the same assembly. Basically, think of this as a project. Remember, we said that an assembly was pretty much the binary that we use to distribute our C# applications. So if you have classes that are in the same project, then those would be accessible if they're internal. But if they're in another project, then they would not be accessible. That's basically the definition of the internal accessibility. Now, the internal accessibility is the default. So if you create a class without specifying public or internal, the assumption is that it will have internal accessibility. Now, the classes are reference types, and that means that when we create an instance of a class, we're going to have a reference returned to us, and we actually manipulate the class objects through that reference. This usually happens through a reference variable. In its very simplest form, therefore, a class is really nothing more than an identifier. In the example at the bottom of the slide, we see a basic representation of an internal class called person. Now, in the open and closed curly braces, that's where we would actually put the members of the class and the definition of the class behaviors. But technically, something as simple as this, the class person with the open and closed curly braces, that qualifies as a class type, and this would actually compile.